Good morning and welcome to our webinar about race. We so far have 5 participants, but I'm sure several people will join us, and people are starting to join. That's wonderful. My name is Dave Huxtable. I am president of ICF Orange County chapter, and I have great pleasure in having with me today to talk about this important subject, Susana Rinderle, Rafael Durand, and Chris Smith. Chris joins us from Jackson, Mississippi. Rafael is in Irvine and Susana is in LA. When I first became president of this chapter, I really wanted to introduce far more conversation about diversity and inclusion. And so this is our first webinar on one of those topics. And for me, something that really illustrated the importance of race in coaching was a conversation I was having with a coachee of mine who is of East Asian ancestry. And he was telling me about a conversation or several conversations he had had with his boss around his leadership qualities, that the boss felt that he was lacking in certain leadership qualities. And in that conversation, this coachee mentioned a couple of times in passing the way he looked. And that was, for me, a key decision point. How am I going to address, how am I going to ask, is this about race? How am I going to ask it in a way that doesn't make it sound like I am questioning his perception of the situation? And so what I said was, how much of this is about race? That was then a turning point in our coaching relationship. I just felt the trust grow, and the kinds of topics we were able to address, just the depth of the coaching engagement increased many fold. And so that's one of the examples I feel of why we want to talk about race and why it's important to ask ourselves, how do we broach this topic? I'm going to be asking questions of each of our panelists, and at various points in our conversations today, there will be opportunities for the participants to ask questions. And you'll notice that at the bottom of your screen, if you move your mouse down in that direction, there is a Q&A button. So I'd be really grateful if any questions you have while we're talking, you type them in there, and then when we get to the Q&A section, we will read them out. Just on those questions, I think it's important to establish what we have as our common understanding on this topic. And for me, the crucial things there are 3 points. Race exists. Maybe not biologically, but socially, psychologically, historically, race exists. Racism is still alive and well and very much with us and impacting the lives of hundreds of millions of people. And saying that I do not see color, I am colorblind, is not true and is not useful. So just those 3 points that we can all agree are not up for discussion. Those are where we're at with our common understanding of what we're talking about. Panelists, would any of you like to add anything to what I was just saying?
Well, I was joking before we went live that, those are pretty much the mic drop points right there when it comes to race and racism. And I appreciate the acknowledgement that, while genetically and biologically we have established that race really doesn't exist, we have to still treat our clients and show up as coaches in a social reality that is the way it is. And so I just second what you said.
Thank you. Cool. So my first question to our illustrious panelists is, and I'm going to ask Rafael first, should we raise the topic of race when coaching? And if so, when and how?
Thank you, Dave. I think that you set the table for discussion beautifully, and I would like just to start by stating the obvious. The client, as a human being, is a complex entity, And as such, race is one of multiple elements in the client existential equation. So it is there. Sometimes even if the client doesn't see it being there. And as coaches, we have to be alert and aware of how these multiple elements of that existential equation play into what the client brought to the coaching engagement. Sometimes race may be relevant for that particular coaching engagement, but many times it's not. So I don't think that we are here to find a way to force it into the conversation or to just make it artificially important in the context of that specific coaching engagement. But we have to be aware as coaches that could be there. No, so should we bring it to the topic? It depends, I guess. If, in my opinion, we could actually get into the race topic in two different ways. Either the client brings it to the table, which is the most obvious and easier way to get into it, or we as coaches identify race as a potential issue in that conversation, and that's, I think, the tricky part, because we may become aware of race as a potential issue through insights, through nonverbal communication, through different ways of that the client has to express him or herself. And if that is a topic, if we identify race as a potential issue, I think that we actually we're responsible to our clients to get into the space, because we are here for the benefit of the client. And if we think that that is the way that we need to help that particular client, we should then address it. How? We have always the golden key, which is ask permission. So I don't think that we should just assume that the client is ready to talk about race. We need really to probe and to ask permission to get into that space. And I believe that by doing that, the client is going to tell us whether he or she is ready, and how he's going to give us more information on how to get into that conversation with them.
Thank you so much, Rafael. Susana, what's your view on that?
Yeah, well, Dave, first of all, thank you so much for including me on the panel, and thanks to ICF Orange County. Chris and Rafael, it's really great to have been working with you on this webinar today. And I'm also appreciating that we bring a diversity of perspectives. In some ways, we're very aligned, and in other ways, we have slightly different approaches. So I'm really excited about, bouncing off each other and building on ideas. And so just to frame what I'm going to say, I have two biases that I bring to the table. The first is that I have had a long career specifically in diversity and inclusion and intercultural relationships and intercultural communication for 2.5 decades. So a lot of the clients that come to me for coaching are coming to me specifically because they know I have that orientation and that skill set. And one of the ways that I market my coaching services is as a person who is particularly excited about and effective working with people who are members of numerically underrepresented and historically marginalized groups. So for me, that's already kind of baked into some of the coaching relationships that I engage in. The second bias that I have is that I was trained in a philosophy and maintain a philosophy that the coaching relationship is one of shared power, where the coach can be and often is transformed and affected as much by the coaching relationship as the client. So what that has to do with and so really, when we're being effective as coaches, to build on what Rafael said, we're really coaching the whole person. And who we are in terms of identity does not get created and reinforced in a vacuum. We're a highly social species, and identities and sense of self is created in community and interaction with others. So even as you mentioned, when the client may not think about themselves in a racial way, when we have that lens, or when I have that lens with my background, that's always something that's top of mind for me in terms of how that might be showing up in a way that's not on their radar. Whether or not I bring that up is a second question, but having that lens can really allow me to listen and elicit in a way that I wouldn't without that lens. And so in response to the question, should we bring the topic up? Mostly yes. Does it matter? Always. And there are three things that I do in terms of, how I bring this up. So first, now that I am a principal consultant at Korn Ferry, we do things a little bit different internally. But when I work with clients outside, or I'm in my previous practice, I did an extensive discovery process. So the potential client would, after a chemistry call and after maybe a sample session, they will complete a rather in-depth questionnaire. And then we would have a 90-minute discovery session, partly to debrief those answers and partly to go deeper on other things. And I have specific questions on my discovery script to ask about racial, ethnic, or cultural identity. So the question is specifically, what is your relevant cultural, racial, ethnic, and linguistic background? And I also ask about spirituality and about family, which oftentimes gives information and markers about other identity groups, including LGBT, for example. So very overtly talk about that in discovery as we create conscious relationship around, what's important to you, how do you identify, how do you see that influencing or not the way that you lead, communicate, show up, whatever it is that their presenting agenda is and how they want to engage in coaching. Secondly, I self-disclose. So because I come from a paradigm of shared power and mutual transformation, once the client has disclosed their identity in discovery, this may play out later in the relationship, we'll talk about that in the next question, I disclose my identities to the extent that I feel, in the language that makes sense to them. So depending on if we're doing this in English or Spanish, I may share with them that I am a multi-identity person, que soy una gringa mexicanizada. So in other words, I'm a Mexicanized white U.S. American who, as far as we know, is biologically white and yet have been a fluent Spanish speaker with a multi-identity and a lot of intersectional experiences from early on in my lifetime. So, bringing that out creates a connection as well as safety. And then finally, and we'll talk about this more in best practices, kind of what Rafael said, and what you also said, Dave, in your beautiful example, is actually asking the question, during coaching. So that's another way that in terms of answering the how is, I had a client, for example, once that I said she happened to be cisgender, African-American leader. And in this case, it actually wasn't race, but this for me was the most powerful example. And I said, how much of the way that you're interacting with this person about gender and sexual orientation? Like, how is your identity as a lesbian inform the way you experience that feedback that he gave you? And again, this is more of a sexual orientation than a race example, but similar to what you said, Dave, not only did that open up all kinds of awareness and possibilities for her, it created greater trust and bond between us, that not only that it meant a lot to her that I thought to even notice that, I had the courage to ask about it and to bring that top of mind. So it made a big difference in that client relationship.
Great, thanks, Susana. And then last but definitely not least, if I could ask the same question to Chris.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me today. It's such a pleasure to be here. I appreciate the opportunity to share with this great panel. What a great question to consider as we are thinking about how we impact the lives of those that we coach for a relationship that is built on trust and transparency and vulnerability. This question about race is a pretty important one. Much like Susana, I will quickly share that my background, or at least my approach to coaching and my particular niche at this point, is coaching female middle managers. That's kind of my kind of place in this work, my brick in the wall, if you will. And in that work, so much of that work is already starting from a place of dealing with perceptions and identity work to get clear about how one appears to other people in the work that they are practicing. Initially, I would say that the matter of race does need to come up, and I do bring that up fairly early in the process. Not necessarily in the discovery session, but definitely in that first session. For me, I ground my clients in a values exercise to begin, and then we do some work about identity. Not assuming that many folks have done some real identity work and digging in, looking at their subcultures and things like that, because it's an easier playing field to know who one is before we start identifying are certain things being trampled upon or being used to keep one down, if you will. Many of my clients deal with issues of the glass cliff. And if that's not a familiar term, dealing with an opportunity where you get a promotion or you get this really great opportunity, but the opportunity is basically set up to fail, right? So you're dealing with a budget crunch or a shortage or a merger or things like that, right? And so instead of dealing with those issues, one could say, oh, I wonder if race is a part of that, right? And it might be gender, or it might be multiple other isms that are available in anyone's working professional life. So that's kind of where I like to start, is to think about those areas about what really are we dealing with before we just attribute it to race. As a person of color, that is not the place that I go to primarily. For those of us, and not to overgeneralize, but those of us who are people of color or minorities, have to come into the door with have to be 2 times as good and things like that, right? We've heard those things before. And so for me, my natural place is not to go to race, it's to go to my effort, right? And so my coaching model is built on that effort is the key to most things, if not all things, right? And so I like to start with my clients talking about their effort, right? What's your current job performance look like? Are you not getting promoted, or are you being overlooked for those transitional periods because of your performance? Maybe it has nothing to do with race, right? So my job, I believe, as a coach, is to eliminate all the other factors before we get to the topic of race. And if race is where we land, then we dig into that place about race. And if it's performance, we're going to talk about performance first, and then work our way back to the other topics. So that's kind of where I kind of lean. It is not natural for me to say, oh, because I'm a minority, that's the first place I'm going to go. It's actually the last place that I go, because it is not a crutch that I am comfortable using, and I don't want to get my clients, not the easy out, but not to use that place to go to first. Yeah. The last point I'll make is that this area about race and coaching, it's very critical to get some clarity about this, especially when I'm dealing with clients that are not of color, right? Because it's a scary topic, right? It's a topic that most folks don't want to broach. And so my approach to that is, you're going to be a better and stronger leader when your emotional intelligence is clear and you can see the full gamut. So to Dave's point, right? Not saying things like, I don't see color, or I treat everyone fairly. We all have biases. We all have prejudice. We're going to be a much stronger and better leader when we can address those things, acknowledge them up front, and then move through the work of getting clear about our coaching journey. So that's my share.
Thank you so much, Chris. And some wonderful points from all of you. I think it's interesting that, we've talked about intersectionality and we've talked about other aspects of identity, and all of which are really important. And I think one of the reasons I chose to speak about race first is, as Chris says, it's the one that many people find the most difficult to broach. I'd like to welcome a colleague of mine from the board of ICF Orange County, Karen Chalevsky, who joins us from somewhere inland from San Francisco. We do have one question from someone who rejoices in the name of anonymous attendee.
Thank you, Dave. And this has been great to hear you guys so far. And I love the show of support today with all these participants. And so thrilled to be here and taking part in this very, very top of mind topic. So thank you for hosting, Dave. It's been fantastic. Thank you so much.
If this question doesn't get answered before, I ask the following. How would you combat a client's request for a coach that is a person of color when you're trying to curb the organization's approach to diversity and inclusion beyond just color, ethnicity, gender, or orientation?
Dave, could you repeat that second half of the question?
Yeah, so it's how do you combat the client's request for a coach that's a person of color when you're trying to curb the organization's approach to diversity and inclusion beyond just color, ethnicity, gender, or orientation?
I can take that unless one of my colleagues feels like they really want to. I can start and we can build. There's a lot there in that question. So what I'm hearing in the subtext there of trying to curb the organization's approach to D&I beyond just race and gender, I don't think those are mutually exclusive. You know, what's important in a coaching relationship is that there be safety and that there be trust and that there be good rapport and communication. So I don't see how it would be a value add to try to convince that client to have a coach that does not match them in an identity group that is important to them. So really, I think it's a both and. Just because one, and I'm also speaking about this through my bias as a person who does organizational development and strategy. So these are not mutually exclusive. So, you know, really getting behind promulgating and reinforcing a message that, you know, we have multiple identities, we are intersectional, you know, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, disability, and gender still matter, and there's all these other stuff, doesn't mean that then we shouldn't respect that client's request, you know, especially if what they're experiencing is microaggressions, discrimination, marginalization, being an only. I think trying to convince them, you know, the coach is there to serve the client. And if that's what the client needs in order to feel like they're going to be able to, you know, move through and into whatever they need to, I think personally it would be disrespectful to not honor that.
If I can add, just from a simplistic standpoint, if that's okay, right? In any other professional development opportunity, if I'm given a budget item or line item to choose a professional development activity, a conference, taking a course, or things like that, we don't ask those questions in those areas, right? We don't say, well, you have to go to a predominantly white conference on leadership. You can't pick one that's focused on women or focused on people of color. So to simplify, right? I know I'm oversimplifying, but to oversimplify it, right? If I'm allowed to pick my coach, just like I would pick any other professional development, and to Susana's point, let me choose what's going to be most comfortable for me and what I believe I'm going to get something out of. Now, if you're choosing a coach for the 6 directors in our department and we need to find some kind of through line that's going to support all of us, well, that's a different topic. But again, if it's my individual choice, then I hope, like any other professional development, I can choose what I believe is best for me.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yes, I think that's you painted beautifully. So not much for me to add. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, interesting example of two things that have happened to me recently. One, a coachee who identified as a woman who said she would rather have a woman coach. Fine. And a coachee who said to me that as someone whose partner is a woman and who went to an all-female school and has lots of sisters and generally has not got used to working with men, and is now in an environment where she is a senior manager in a tech company which is very male dominated, she actually wanted to have a male coach because that was one of the things that she wanted to work on. So yeah. Interesting to bring in those other aspects of identity.
Okay, so the next question is from Mark, and then we've got a couple comments in the chat as well. Mark says, I feel that the coaching industry has an opportunity to address the exclusion and the privilege that exists in coaching and who has access to the benefits of coaching. How do we as coaches help break down that barrier and provide access to people of color or any disadvantaged community? The more people have access, the better. So how do we as coaches help break down that barrier of access, the accessibility? Great question, Mark. Thank you.
If you allow me, I've been in Orange County for the past 3 months only, but I would like just to start answering Mark's question on what I've seen, Mark, is that, for example, the Orange County ICF chapter have several engagements with non-for-profit organizations in the area where we coach members volunteer for coaching pro bono, and we help people that are part of the network of those non-for-profits and through coaching. And I think that's one way that I've seen us coaches reaching out and helping people in disadvantaged situations.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning that, Rafael, because the design of that particular pro bono coaching program, to apply to be a client, one of the criteria is that you work for an NGO which promotes inclusion. And there are several questions that people get to fill out in that application to say, how relevant is diversity and inclusion to the work of your NGO?
Yeah. Yeah, I'd like to add, first of all, just want to clarify that it sounds like we're talking about some intersectionality here. So it sounds like we're talking about race and class, because not all people of color are unable to pay for coaching. And, disproportionately people of color do find themselves in lower socioeconomic strata. So just want to call that out in terms of conflation of identities. But what I'd add are a couple things. Number one, when I was an independent coach, I would have different fee structures. So if there was somebody who was really in need and it was a good fit, I would, do a different rate for people from marginalized backgrounds. Also donating pro bono coaching time to local nonprofits that are working with folks in transition, whether I've not done this myself, but I've made myself available to organizations where folks are just leaving incarceration or women that are moving from domestic violence into, a more supportive life environment. And the last thing is I learned, I didn't mean to be rude earlier. I know it looked like I was looking at my phone because there's an organization I learned about not long ago called Women for Change, where some of you are nodding. So this is an organization where the coach actually pays a nominal fee and then provides pro bono coaching to women in transition, many of whom are of color. So there are organizations that are starting to appear that are starting to make coaching more accessible. And I think that's a great question.
So this is more of a regional response because I'm in Mississippi. So because of where I am, with Mississippi being 50th, unfortunately, in a lot of things, education, healthcare, et cetera, this thing called coaching is not really a thing down here, right? So since my 4 years since I've been here, moving from Milwaukee, Wisconsin to Jackson, Mississippi, talking about coaching is a nominal thing. They have no idea what I'm talking about, right? And so the way I'm having to educate people about coaching before I even talk about having access to coaching, right? And so for those who do know what it is, that's only reserved for the CEOs or the C-suite in their organizations. They know that they have coaches or there's somebody that works with them, but they don't know what that is and has never been offered to them in that way. So my way of offering those services has been through free workshops. So I do a lot of free workshops through the United Way and several other nonprofits in the area. I go to a lot of the shared workspaces or co-op workspaces like WeWork and things like that, and offer free services there so that people know that I'm here, and then offer them the opportunity for coaching through that way. So depending on where you are, just getting the word out about what this thing about coaching is might be the first step.
Magnificent. Thank you so much, everyone. So we have another Q&A session coming up, just to make sure that people are aware that we're making this as interactive as we can. But I'm going to move on to the next question, and I will start off by asking Chris, what best practices can you share?
Okay, so I basically have three main topics, right? For me, in terms of best practices, one would be really to, as I said before, really get to the place of putting all the identities and all the subcultures on the table, right? Again, for some leaders, time for reflection, time to think about that, where I'm trying to balance budgets, take care of my staff, get products at the door. I may not have time or have found time to get that done, right? So I think really taking a step back and getting that done, right? What does it mean for me to be at this altitude, to be thinking about this work and not taking care of myself or thinking about my lens in my work? So I think that's one of the best practices for me, is to start and getting clear about our lens. I think the second is to really spend some time in social and emotional intelligence, really thinking about who you are and how you're participating in your work, how you are impacting other people, right? Thinking about your intention versus impact, and really getting clear about how are you impacting or affecting those around you, and could it be that your approach, your attitude, your behavior could be mistaken for an ism, right? And so we want to address that. And then I think third for me in this coaching practice is really thinking about the trust of the relationship. As a coach, can we really create an atmosphere and an environment for folks to get figuratively naked to the point where we can actually address some of those topics, whether they're a person of color or not, or whatever, to Susana's point, intersectionality that they are navigating. The idea is, can you sit still long enough and get clear enough so that we can have real authentic conversations, right? Because if you can't do that with me, you're certainly not going to do that with your staff, and you're certainly not going to do that with your peers, especially when there's so much about fear, about embarrassment, about status in our workplaces. So those are the three places that I would start: emotional, social intelligence, really getting clear about our identities, and then focusing on the trust in the relationship.
Yeah.
Thanks, Chris. And Rafael, could you go next on that question?
Yes, Dave, thank you. I have had the opportunity to live and work in 5 different countries, and I am actually first generation immigrant to the US. So one of the things that I pay attention a lot is on trying to learn about the culture that I am in. And even within the US, I have had the opportunity to live in the Northeast, in the Mid-South, and also now in the Pacific Coast. So it's like, to an extent, living in or experienced also 3 different countries within the same country in many ways. So I think that as coaches, focusing on what the main cultural characteristics inform social and personal relationships is important for us to coaches to understand. So that could be one way. Second, and along the lines that Chris just mentioned, self-awareness is critical in my opinion. Self-awareness from a coach perspective, and self-awareness to learn up from on the client as well. And in my experience, the race question, the race topic runs both ways. Could be actually something that the client is going to bring to the table because the client is suffering because of a race particular issue, or could be that race is getting in front of the client and as a blind spot, not something that he or she is particularly being impacted from either from the managers or the colleagues, but it's something that is getting in front of the client. And that is an important part of being self-aware. And us as coaches, we as coaches, we can actually help lift that curtain, if you will, for the client to see clearly, not only in both ways. And the third aspect of it is also, as Chris just said, create that trust in the relationship, trust that allow the client to reach out to us as partners in the relationship, but also to reach out internally so that he or she finds the best ways to address those particular elusive situations that are blocking them to progress.
Thanks, Rafael. And Susana.
This has been so great, Dave. You know, one of the things I love about teaching and being on panels is I learn from colleagues and get reminders about things I forgot. So this is great. I'll add to what has not been said. So actually, first I'm going to reiterate what I said in the first part of the webinar, because those were sort of stealth best practices. So the first one was ask about it in discovery. So ask about racial identity, explore the meaning there, explore the relevance so that you then set yourself up to have those conversations later. Again, I choose to self-disclose. That may not be in alignment with any of the, other coaches may choose to have a different style or approach different philosophy, but that's been one of my best practices, again, to create trust and normalize the fact that this can be talked about and that I am aware and I'm doing my personal work around this as well. So sort of third from the last section, but bleeding into this one and in alignment with my colleagues, I think we can't say it enough, which is talk about it. Say it out loud, name it. And on top of that, my additional 3 final best practices are, number 1, self-management. So building on what Rafael just said about self-awareness, not just self-awareness and self-management. So especially for white folks, this is not a conversation that most of us are used to having, are comfortable having, don't have a lot of role models for how to have it in a way that is constructive and generative and safe. And so building your own tolerance for discomfort and resilience around making mistakes is key. Too many white people, I think, start to have the conversation and make a mistake or are concerned about offending, and then they stop it there, when actually that was an entry point to more clarity and more intimacy. So building our own ability to be resilient and to tolerate discomfort and to be courageous in going into those conversations, knowing we are going to mess up and not do it perfectly, I think is critical. Along those lines, the second thing is kind of it's similar, but building tolerance for messiness. It's not going to be perfect. It's not going to be neat. And yet this is an opportunity for us to really be in integrity and to practice what we preach. We don't really preach as coaches, but we're asking our clients to really lean into their growing edges and to be courageous. And so doing that ourselves as well, I think, is a way of being congruent and in integrity with the coaching profession and applying that to ourselves. And the final is noticing and responding to cues. So Dave, your initial story, I think, was a great example of that. You heard your client mention the way he looked twice, and that was coded language for race. And so you heard that, you picked up on it, and you went there and you explored. So just like we listen for other cues in terms of stories that our clients might be telling themselves, patterns of beliefs that may not be serving them, assumptions and characterizations, this should be another, in my opinion, filter that we put on in terms of noticing for cues, in terms of what is up for them, what is relevant to them, what is informing the story they're telling about what they're experiencing. So building our muscle around that as well as our courage to go there.
Wow, thank you. So many wonderful points.
Yes, Dave, I agree. And just so all of you know, I have captured those in the chat section, because if we just listen to you guys and we actually don't get to capture all those beautiful points, I mean, thank you so much for all of you for contributing. It's such a proud moment to be part of this, to be part of coaching in this topic. So if the attendees, if you want to take a screenshot, and you can have access to that right away before we send out the recording.
Indeed. So we've reached our second Q&A slot, and there's a lot going on in the chat. So thank you so much, Karen, for making notes and making those available. So let's have a look in there to see if there are any questions. And if anyone's got any other questions, then please, it's probably better to put them in the Q&A, because then we can process them easier.
Dave, there was a question from Danielle earlier that I don't think we got to. I know Chris responded in chat, but do we want to bring that into the room perhaps?
Yeah, let's.
Yeah. Yes, I think we should. Thank you, Suzanne. I wanted to circle back around to that, and thank you for pointing this as a good time. So this is from Daniela, and it's the question is as stated, question/comment/topic. As a woman of color who seeks people of color coaches for a variety of reasons, I think it is terrifying and oppressive that the client's request would even be considered for squashing. And Chris, you had initiated the response to that, and we can go from there and jump in on Daniela's comment.
I was actually referring to the question about ICF.
Oh, I just see that. She has another question. So that was our comment, which we could readdress to that. And then you're right, Danielle does have a comment. Do ICF coaches receive ongoing training in implicit bias, institutional and structural racism? Is her other follow-up question.
I think the answer to that is probably not. No. So there's nothing within the ICF credentialing process that says that coaches have to receive that kind of training. There are, of course, lots and lots of different coaching schools, each of which will have their own approaches, and many of which are authorized recognized by ICF. But I don't think that is a required part of coach training at the moment. But I have a very strong feeling that it should be.
It's a very good question. I think that I don't recall, having seen that particular topic in terms of requirement training. And I know in my case is that I got trained, but through my life in the corporate world, but not through the coaching institutions, no.
Yeah, and yes to all that. And I'll add that I went to ICF Converge a year ago or 2 years ago, and I was very sad to see that I don't remember there being even one panel that addressed this question in any substantial way. So this is definitely an area of opportunity, especially if ICF wants to position itself to serve the community, not just of the future, but who is in our workplace and who is in our society right now. Indeed.
Yeah, excellent idea.
Sounds like some of our panelists are volunteering to lead this.
Dun, ta-da!
Wonderful.
Well, yeah, like Dave said, this will be a quarterly discussion, right, Dave? We're going to be continuing this topic as it is so important.
We're going to be continuing the topic of diversity and inclusion. And I think having, because we had that feeling that race was the tough entry point, we've done that. And of course, even today, our conversation has been very much around intersectionality. And people don't have just one identity. So in our future conversations, now that we have enabled ourselves to talk about race, our future conversations, whatever they're about, if they're about gender, if they're about if they're about gender identity, if they're about sexual orientation, we will continue with that intersectionality discussion.
By the way, I just want to check an assumption. I'm making the assumption that people know what that is. And so just in case people don't know what that term means, may I define?
Please
so
do.
The word intersectionality was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, who is African-American critical race theorist, actually, I think a fellow Bruin. Woohoo! UCLA! It's become much more common in the lexicon now. In fact, even in the corporate spaces I find myself in, more and more people are familiar with the term. But anyway, intersectionality originally was meant by Dr. Crenshaw to talk about the ways that when one has multiple power non-dominant identities / marginalized identities, that they intersect with each other to create even more layers of oppression. So for example, a white woman's experience is not the same as a woman of color's experience because race contributes to her experience of being a female that's different than a white woman. It's been expanded to mean that our various multiple identities intersect with each other to create nuanced and subtle gradations of experience based on identity that are not just discrete categories. So that again, you know, a man of African American descent has a different experience than a man who was a part of the elite class in Nigeria emigrating to the United States. So, you know, just all those multiple identities intersect and create even more subtlety and nuance and richness in how we experience ourselves and how the world shows up and experiences us. Karen and Dave, I don't want to take over your function, but Val asked a question about D&I and intercultural.
Cool, go for it.
Yep, and then we have another one in the in the Q&A, which we'll get to after Val's question.
Okay, I think that was me that said that. I was just trying to Google an article I wrote 3 or 4 years ago that explains the difference. I can follow up and try to find that, but sort of the basic bullet points I would give Val in terms of the difference between D&I and interculturalism is that the two fields are rooted in different, they have different origins and therefore somewhat different flavors. So interculturalism was born out of the research around cultural differences. I studied in a program that was informed by some of the major folks like Everett Rogers and Edward T. Hall and John Condon, and many of these were affluent white men coming to other parts of the world and to the American Southwest to really study culture, which then moved into how do we prepare diplomats and elites in the United States to better interact with diplomats, politicians, and business people in other countries. The diversity and inclusion field was mostly born out of the civil rights movements of the 60s, and so it had much more of a social justice, reparations type flavor. So while I am definitely a both and person, that I was trained in interculturalism and now very much identify as a D&I person, I think the two should come together because there's a lot of knowledge in the intercultural field that would be critical to addressing some of the differences in D&I. But D&I has an understanding of the domestic diversity issues in the United States around race, class, gender, the history of slavery, the history of genocide, the history of power differences, and the way that those show up not just in the workplace but in society that I think really is missing in interculturalism. So those are my bullet points, and you can Google the article, and I'm sure my colleagues might have other things to add. So they're not necessarily mutually exclusive, but there's really some origin and philosophical differences in terms of what they notice, what they're strong at, and where they come from.
That was a great explanation. I don't know if anyone wants to add on or not, because we have another. Okay, cool. Thank you.
Exactly.
Mic drop, Susana. That was awesome. All right, excellent. We have Dave. Do we have time for one more question?
We do indeed. Yeah.
Okay. So we have one more question in the chat, and this is from Anonymous Attendee. Thank you for joining us today. How can coaches help a client recognize that some of their words and actions can be perceived as deep-rooted ism? I'm assuming that's ageism, sexism, racism, when clients can get very defensive on this topic.
I think that if the topic is coming to the table, is because there's some evidence that it's creating a problem, either for the client or for somebody who relates to the client. So I think that one way of helping the client is to position those topics from the perspective of what is perception. In an interpersonal relationship, perception becomes reality. So it may be for the client, the other who is perceiving the impact is wrong, but at the end of the day, if that is what other person is perceiving, becomes reality. So I think that trying to educate the client on those concepts may help bridge that potential client to the item at stake.
Thank you, Rafael. So having that bridge there to just get the conversation started. Yeah, Susana, you want to add?
Carrie, could you repeat the question again? I want to make sure
Absolutely.
I heard it.
Sure,
right.
Of course. Okay. How can coaches help a client recognize that some of their words and actions can be perceived as deep-rooted ism when the client gets very defensive on this topic?
Ooh.
Sore spot for the client.
I feel like I've taken up a lot of airtime today, so I'm going to be brief. I would say, one of the most profound concepts in diversity and inclusion is that intent does not equal impact. So to me, it would be hard to answer that question in detail without understanding the dynamics of why this topic is coming up. Is this the reason the person is getting coaching? Sometimes I've been asked to do coaching of people who really it's about, can you rehabilitate this bigot in the workplace that's not behaving appropriately? And then when you dig deeper, there's more there, right? And so if part of the coaching is to help that person be more effective in their role and whatever they're doing, then really helping them unpack, what was the behavior and what was the impact? And, how can we detach you from your intent? So really helping people understand that this may not be questioning your integrity as a person, your heart, your intelligence, and here's how it landed. And so now what are your choices in there to have a different impact and align your good intentions with your impacts? So
I have two short points. One is, this is why I start with the value work and identity work, so that we have a foundation, right? So for instance, if a client says that one of their core values is diversity, or they value honesty, or things like that, I often tell them that there's a consequence to having values like that. And one of the consequences is that you have to be open to putting everything on the table, right? So if you do value diversity, then to Rafael's point, if you're getting messages that there might be something about your approach or your style that others may perceive isms, then you have to put that on the table. You have to be willing to look at that and examine that, right? That's where real growth, that's where real development happens. And then the second point that I would make is stealing from the book, Thanks for the Feedback, looking at the three triggers, right? The relationship, identity, and truth triggers. Maybe the client is dealing with one of those triggers. Probably most likely it's the identity trigger, that I'm such a good person, there's no way it's not me, I'm not experiencing an ism, or I'm not perpetrating an ism. And we just really need to address the fact that it's not about you, it's about how you're showing up. And let's address how you're showing up. Again, to Susana's point, it's not personal. There's just something about in which you are relating to other people, relating to other people. Let's address the behavior. It's not saying that you're a bad person.
That's great. Chris, what was the name of that book?
Absolutely magnificent.
Thanks for the feedback. Own and Hen.
Magnificent, wonderful. Mark is asking, are the panelists open to be contacted? If so, what is the best way to do so? Thank you so much for organizing this and for taking the time out of your schedules to talk about such an important topic.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yes. Yes. And perhaps, the easiest way is, I don't know if you want us to type our contact information on the chat, or you, Dave?
Susana's already done it. Yep.
Oh,
so
Susana.
Okay. Yeah.
And then while you guys are putting your contact information there, you've listed a bunch of great resources and books and of recommendations so far. Any other, we do have a question for any other that you would recommend, classes or book, to help coaches on these topics? It's a lot. So top one or two, I'd say. And Chris, you can't say thanks for the feedback because I put that in there already.
Someone earlier put in the chat Uprooting Racism, which I think is great, Paul Kivel. There's so many good resources out there. It's just like, what specifically do you want to be working on? But my book will be out in 2020, so you can wait for that one.
What's your book about?
New school diversity, how to do diversity in the new school way, not the old school way, which means thinking, talking, and acting differently.
Magnificent. We very much look forward to that. Sadly, the time has caught up with us. It is midday California, 2 p.m. Mississippi. So we can continue this conversation on Facebook. Probably let's just say Facebook. So if we have more conversation to be had, our Facebook page is at ICF Orange County on Facebook. So let's continue the conversation there. I would like to offer my profuse thanks to my magnificent panelists. It's been wonderful working with you guys. Thank you so much for your time, and knowledge, and expertise. And let's do this again at some point.
Thank you, David.
Thanks.
Thank you.
My great pleasure. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
And thank you everyone, for all of our audience for taking part. You've been great too.
Thank you, Orange County coaches, and thank you, panelists.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you very much, everyone.